The grand theater of human existence has long been staged upon a fundamental misunderstanding, a persistent illusion that the mind is the generator of thought rather than its receiver. We have walked through the corridors of our lives under the heavy, often exhausting assumption that our skulls house a biological factory, a tireless engine of cognition that must labor day and night to manufacture meaning, identity, and direction. This perspective places a staggering burden on the individual, forcing the fragile self to carry the weight of an entire universe's worth of complexity. Yet, if we pause and listen to the static that hums beneath our daily anxieties, we might begin to sense a different reality. We are not the source of the broadcast. We are the instrument through which the music of the cosmos finds its local expression. To understand that you are a radio, not a brain, is to step out of the frantic role of the creator and into the profound, graceful role of the conduit. It is the beginning of the unfiltered truth, a realization that your consciousness is a sophisticated aperture through which the infinite gazes upon itself. Imagine, if you will, a vast and invisible sea of frequencies, an ocean of information that knows no boundary of time or space. This is the source, the primordial field of intelligence that permeates every atom and every void. Within this field, every possibility, every symphony, every scientific breakthrough, and every whisper of ancient wisdom already exists in a state of potential. The biological organ we call the brain is not a self-contained island of logic, but a highly specialized crystalline receiver, tuned by the delicate dial of our attention and the unique copper wiring of our nervous systems. When we believe we are thinking, we are often merely scanning the airwaves, catching glimpses of greater patterns and mistaking them for our own private inventions. This shift in perspective does not diminish the human experience. Rather, it elevates it to a level of cosmic participation that we have forgotten in our modern, materialistic trance. For centuries, we have been taught to sharpen the intellect as if it were a weapon, a tool to carve out a place in a hostile world. We have obsessed over the hardware of our gray matter, measuring its capacity and lamenting its limitations. But a radio is not judged by the plastic of its casing or the brand name on its dial. It is judged by the clarity of the signal it can capture. The unfiltered truth suggests that our current state of global exhaustion stems from a collective attempt to think our way into peace, to compute our way into love, and to engineer our way into spiritual fulfillment. We are like a radio, trying to play music by rattling its own components together, ignoring the fact that the most beautiful melodies are already vibrating through the room, waiting for us to simply align our internal circuitry to the correct station. This inquiry into the source is not merely a philosophical exercise, it is a practical rescue mission for the soul. When we identify as the generator of our thoughts, we become responsible for every dark shadow, every intrusive impulse, and every creative block. We become trapped in the ego factory, believing that if the production line stops, we cease to exist. However, when we embrace the metaphor of the radio, we find a radical form of liberation. If a radio plays a song of sorrow, the radio itself is not sad, it is simply vibrating in sympathy with a sad frequency. If it plays a song of triumph, it does not become arrogant. By detaching our identity from the content of the broadcast, we gain the sovereignty to choose which stations we inhabit. We move from being the prisoner of the signal to being the master of the dial. The journey toward the source requires us to peel back the layers of societal conditioning that have jammed our reception for generations. From the moment we enter this world, we are bombarded by low-frequency transmissions, fear, scarcity, division, and the relentless noise of the mundane. These external signals create a layer of interference, a psychic smog that makes the clear, high-frequency whispers of the source seem like distant myths or impossible dreams. To tune in, we must first recognize the interference for what it is. We must understand that the static of our modern lives is not a fundamental feature of reality, but a result of being tuned to the wrong channel. This exploration is an invitation to quiet the internal chatter of the biological machine and rediscover the silent, perfect frequency that has been playing since before the stars were born. As we stand at the threshold of this understanding, we must ask ourselves what it would mean to live as a clear vessel. What would happen to our creativity, our relationships, and our sense of purpose if we stopped trying to force the mind to perform and instead allowed the source to flow through us unimpeded? The unfiltered truth is that you have never been alone in your head. You have always been part of a grand, celestial conversation. The brain is the bridge, the interface between the infinite and the finite. But the you that truly matters is the listener. It is time to stop the internal noise, to let the mechanism rest, and to finally hear the signal that has been calling your name through the cosmic winds. We are moving beyond the myth of the self-made mind and into the reality of the divinely tuned life. To grasp the magnitude of the radio metaphor, one must first dismantle the long-held dogma of biological centralism, the belief that consciousness is a byproduct of the brain's physical architecture. The core theme of this realization rests upon the concept of non-local intelligence. If we look at a television set, we do not assume that the actors, the scenery, and the scripts are living inside the wires and glass. We recognize that the device is simply translating an invisible signal into a visible form. Similarly, the first pillar of the unfiltered truth is the understanding that the brain does not produce consciousness any more than a radio produces music. Instead, the brain acts as a step-down transformer, taking the vast, blinding light of the source and narrowing it into a manageable, linear stream of experience. This filtering is necessary for survival in a physical world, but when the filter becomes too dense, we lose touch with the very energy that sustains us, leading to the spiritual dehydration that defines much of the modern era. Another vital concept within this framework is the law of resonance. In the world of frequency, like attracts like. A radio receiver can only manifest the sounds of the station to which it is precisely tuned. This means that our internal state, our vibrational signature, determines the quality of the reality we perceive. If our internal circuitry is gummed up with the heavy resins of resentment, fear, or chronic stress, we naturally fall into resonance with frequencies that reflect those states. We begin to hear the broadcasts of a hostile world, a failing society, or a meaningless existence. However, the profound secret is that the source is always broadcasting every possible station simultaneously. The music of the spheres, the frequency of abundance, and the signal of divine love are never off the air. They are simply waiting for the listener to adjust their internal dial. We do not need to change the world. We need to change our reception. This brings us to the concept of the interference pattern, which serves as the primary barrier between the individual and the source. Throughout our lives, we accumulate what can be described as psychic static. This noise is composed of inherited traumas, societal expectations, and the constant, frantic chatter of the ego trying to maintain its illusion of control. When this static becomes loud enough, it creates a feedback loop. We mistake the noise for our own identity. We say, "I am an anxious person," rather than "my receiver is currently picking up an anxious frequency." By identifying with the static, we inadvertently reinforce the very barrier that keeps us from the source. The work of spiritual awakening is essentially an engineering project, a process of clearing the wires, grounding the system, and learning how to bypass the interference to reach the pure underlying signal. Central to this shift is the realization that the ego is not an enemy to be destroyed, but a specific frequency band that serves a functional purpose. The problem arises when we become locked onto the ego station, unable to turn the dial to higher or more expansive states of being. The ego is the frequency of I, me, and mine, which is useful for navigating a physical body through a physical world, but it is a narrow and often repetitive broadcast. When we learn to treat the ego as just one of many available channels, we regain our sovereignty. We can tune into the ego when we need to pay our taxes or drive a car, but we can just as easily tune into the source when we wish to create, to heal, or to experience the boundless unity of existence. This fluidity of focus is what it truly means to be awake. Furthermore, we must address the concept of the universal symphony. If every human being is a radio, then humanity as a whole is a vast, interconnected network of receivers. When we are all tuned to the low-frequency signals of competition and scarcity, the collective music of our species becomes discordant and chaotic. But as individuals begin to tune their instruments to the source, the frequency of wholeness and creative expansion, the collective broadcast begins to change. Each person who achieves a clear signal acts as a repeater, amplifying that frequency for everyone else in their vicinity. This is why the presence of a truly tuned-in individual can feel so palpable and transformative. They are literally vibrating at a pitch that reminds our own internal receivers of what is possible. Finally, we must consider the theme of the great forgetting and the grand recall. We are born with our dial set to the source, but the process of socialization acts as a systematic detuning. We are told which stations are real and which are imaginary, until eventually we forget that we ever had a dial at all. We become convinced that the static is the only sound in the universe. The unfiltered truth is a process of remembering how to use our own equipment. It is the discovery that the source is not some far-off destination or a deity sitting on a throne, but the very carrier wave of our existence. To tune into it is to return home into a state of being that is prior to thought, prior to labels, and prior to the limitations of the biological brain. It is the realization that while the radio may eventually break, the broadcast is eternal. To truly fathom the mystery of the cosmic receiver, we must look toward the ancient tales and symbolic landscapes that have mirrored this truth long before the invention of the vacuum tube or the silicon chip. Consider the allegory of the Great Loom, an eternal tapestry being woven in a dimension just behind the veil of our physical sight. In this story, the human soul is not the weaver, nor even the thread, but the shuttle, the moving part that carries the color of the source into the fabric of time. When the shuttle forgets its purpose and tries to weave its own isolated pattern, the thread tangles, the rhythm falters, and the cloth becomes knotted with the static of ego. But when the shuttle remains hollow and receptive, allowing the great weaver's hand to guide its flight, the pattern emerges with a complexity and beauty that no individual mind could ever conceive. The shuttle's only work is to stay smooth, polished, and empty, ensuring it does not snag the divine thread as it passes through. Another narrative tells of a kingdom where every citizen was born with a silver mirror strapped to their chest. In the early days of the kingdom, the people lived in harmony because they understood that the light dancing upon their mirrors came from a single, central sun high above the mountain peaks. They would tilt their bodies to catch the rays, reflecting the warmth into the dark valleys and sharing the brilliance with one another. However, as the ages passed, a strange pride took hold. The people began to believe that the light was coming from the mirrors themselves. They started polishing their mirrors with obsessive vanity, building walls to protect their light from neighbors, and eventually painting elaborate designs over the glass to claim the light as their personal brand. Soon, the mirrors became dull and dark, the kingdom fell into shadow, and the people grew cold and bitter, fighting over the few remaining glimmers. They had forgotten that a mirror's only power is its ability to disappear into what it reflects. To tune into the source is to scrape away the paint of the ego and realize that the light you claimed as yours was always a gift from the heights. In the mystical traditions of the East, there is often talk of the hollow bamboo, a metaphor for the seeker who wishes to become an instrument for the divine. If the bamboo is filled with its own pulp, its own opinions, its own rigid history, and its own frantic desires, the wind can blow against it all day and produce nothing but a dull thud. But when the bamboo is hollowed out, when it offers nothing but its own emptiness to the sky, the wind becomes a flute player. The music that emerges is not the bamboo's music, yet without the bamboo's specific shape and length, that particular melody could never be heard on Earth. This is the ultimate paradox of the radio brain. Your individuality is not found in what you produce, but in the unique tone you give to the universal signal. Your personality is the shape of the flute. Your spirit is the breath of the source. We can also look to the myth of the celestial library, a place where every book ever written and every thought ever conceived is stored in a hall of infinite mirrors. Many wander these halls trying to write their own stories, scratching frantically at blank pages with dry pens, only to find themselves exhausted and frustrated. They are like the brain that tries to manufacture its own wisdom from the vacuum of its own isolation. But the true sages are those who walk through the library with their hands open, realizing that their task is not to write, but to read. They understand that they are a lens through which a pre-existing truth is brought into focus. When you tune in, you are essentially opening a book that was written for you before the beginning of time, allowing the words to flow through your eyes and out into your hands. The creative act is not one of invention, but of discovery. Finally, consider the parable of the lighthouse and the fog. The lighthouse does not create the light. It houses a lamp that is fed by a deep, hidden reservoir of oil. Its only duty is to keep the glass clean. When the fog of the world rolls in, the dense, heavy vapors of collective doubt and materialistic noise, the lighthouse does not panic or try to think the fog away. It simply remains still and stays lit. It trusts that the light it carries is of a different nature than the darkness it faces. As a radio, you are that lighthouse. The source is the oil, and your consciousness is the glass. If the glass is smoked with the soot of self-importance, or the grime of constant distraction, the light is smothered, regardless of how bright the source may be. The unfiltered truth is that we do not need more power or more brain capacity. We simply need to clean the windows of our perception so the light that is already there can find its way through the mist. Transitioning from the celestial metaphor of the radio to the grit of daily life requires a radical revaluation of how we manage our internal energy. If we truly accept that we are receivers, the most important task of our day is no longer doing or thinking, but tuning. This begins with the recognition that our attention is the dial of the radio. In the modern world, thousands of external forces, advertisements, social media algorithms, political theater, and cultural expectations are constantly trying to reach out and turn our dial for us. They want us tuned to the frequency of not enough, outrage, or perpetual distraction. Practical integration starts with reclaiming the sovereignty of the dial. It means becoming fiercely protective of the first moments of the day, refusing to let the static of the world's broadcast flood your circuitry before you have established a clear connection with the source. By consciously choosing a high-frequency anchor through silence, breath, or intentional stillness, you set the resonance for everything that follows. This shift changes the way we approach problem-solving and creativity. Traditionally, when faced with a challenge, we rack our brains, a term that perfectly illustrates the violence we do to our biological hardware when we try to force it to manufacture a solution. Under the radio model, we learn to listen for the answer instead. This involves a process of intellectual relaxation. When a blockage occurs, the most effective action is often to stop the frantic spinning of the mental gears and widen the aperture of the mind. We create a vacuum of receptivity. In this state, we aren't looking for a thought. We are making room for a transmission. Many of history's greatest innovators describe their breakthroughs not as something they built, but as something that came to them in a flash of insight. By practicing this receptive posture in small ways, letting go of the need to have an immediate opinion or waiting for a gut feeling to settle, we begin to experience a life lived in flow rather than a life lived in friction. The implications for our emotional health are equally profound. Much of our psychological suffering comes from the identification error, where we believe that every thought that passes through our head belongs to us. If a dark or self-sabotaging thought arises, we feel guilt or shame as if we are the author of that darkness. However, as a radio, you realize that you might simply be passing through a low-frequency zone or picking up the collective static of your environment. This realization allows for a compassionate detachment. You can observe a thought and say, "That is an interesting broadcast," without letting it define your identity. This creates a psychological buffer zone, a space where the true you, the listener, remains untouched by the content of the transmission. Over time, this practice naturally cleanses your internal circuitry as you stop feeding the low-frequency signals with the energy of your belief, causing them to eventually fade from your reception. In the realm of relationships, the radio metaphor transforms how we interact with others. We stop seeing people as fixed. solid entities, and begin to see them as dynamic receivers who are often just as mistuned as we are. When someone speaks to you in anger or judgment, you can recognize that they are currently tuned to a station of pain. Instead of reacting with your own static, which only creates more interference, you have the option to maintain your own high-frequency signal. This is the tuning fork effect. If you stay resonant with the source, with a frequency of peace and clarity, you offer a point of calibration for the other person. You are not fixing them. You are simply providing a clearer broadcast that their own internal receiver can eventually latch onto. This is the hidden architecture of true leadership and healing, the ability to hold a frequency so steady that the world around you has no choice but to harmonize with it. Finally, integrating this truth leads to a shift from a scarcity mindset to an abundance of signal. We often live as if there is a limited amount of wisdom, luck, or opportunity available to us, much like people fighting over a physical object. But there is no limit to a radio broadcast. 1,000,000 radios can tune into the same beautiful symphony without any one radio receiving less of the music. When we realize that the source is an infinite broadcast, the competitive urge dies away. We no longer need to hoard ideas or protect our intellectual property with the same ferocity, because we know that the source is an inexhaustible well. We become generous with our insights and our energy, knowing that as long as we stay tuned, the supply is limitless. Life stops being a series of transactions and starts being a continuous act of transmission, where our primary goal is simply to be the clearest, loudest, and most faithful expression of the light we are receiving. The realization that you are a radio, not a brain, is the ultimate homecoming for the modern soul. It is the moment the weary traveler puts down the heavy luggage of self-creation and recognizes that the path has been paved and illuminated all along. We have spent far too much of our precious life force trying to be the architects of a reality that is already perfectly designed, exhausting our biological hardware in a desperate attempt to manufacture a light that is naturally ours to receive. The unfiltered truth does not ask you to become something new. It asks you to stop interfering with what you already are. By shifting your identity from the generator of thought to the witness of the broadcast, you enter into a state of effortless grace, where the vast intelligence of the source begins to move through your hands, speak through your lips, and see through your eyes. As we bring this exploration to a close, consider the profound silence that exists beneath the noise of your mind. That silence is not an absence, but the presence of the carrier wave, the fundamental frequency of existence that holds all other melodies in place. Your life is not a series of random events or the product of a lonely, struggling ego. It is a unique, localized performance of the infinite. Every challenge you have faced was merely a moment of recalibration, a nudge from the universe to turn the dial away from the static of the mundane and back toward the music of the spheres. You were never meant to carry the weight of the world. You were meant to reflect its brilliance. When you finally surrender the illusion of the brain as creator, you don't lose your power. You finally plug into the only power that has ever truly existed. The transformational call is an invitation to live as a conscious instrument. It is a commitment to the daily hygiene of the soul, the constant, gentle act of clearing the glass and tuning the dial. This does not require you to retreat from the world, but to engage with it from a different depth. It means walking through your days with the quiet confidence of one who knows they have been breathed by a greater life. It means listening more than you speak, sensing more than you judge, and trusting that the signal of the source is always stronger than the static of the world. You are the bridge between the unseen and the seen, the point where the eternal finds its voice in time. Your only responsibility is to stay resonant, to stay clear, and to stay open. Step out into the world now, not as a solitary mind trying to survive, but as a divine receiver ready to thrive. Pay attention to the synchronicities, the sudden flashes of knowing, and the quiet hum of peace that arises when you let go of the need to control the broadcast. The music is playing, the signal is clear, and the source is calling. All you have to do is turn the dial. You are not a human being having a spiritual experience. You are a cosmic frequency having a human experience. Let the music play through you. Let the light shine through you. And finally, for the first time in your life, listen to the unfiltered truth of who you really are. The broadcast is live, and the world is waiting to hear your song.